The cowboy didn't know what to say. She had stepped off the transport barefoot, knees shaking, and bowed so low her forehead touched the dirt. "Watashi wa anata no meshitsukai ni narimasu," she whispered. The interpreter beside him frowned, then translated flatly. "She says, 'I'll be your servant.'" The cowboy swallowed hard. This girl, thin as rope, face gaunt, uniform torn, had mistaken a hat-wearing ranch hand with a rope belt for a master. He'd been told they were enemy warriors, killers. Instead, she stood before him, trembling like a stray dog. He took off his hat. "Ma'am, that ain't how this works." She blinked, confused, and just like that, the war in her mind began to unravel. She was one of many, brought from a ruined empire to a cattle ranch turned POW camp. But her story would be remembered not for battles fought, but for what happened when dignity was offered to someone who never thought she deserved it. She blinked, confused. Her knees were still bent in the dust, her forehead hovering just above the ground. A breeze carried the scent of manure and hay through the quiet yard. The cowboy who had spoken, broad-shouldered, sunburned, barely 30, shifted awkwardly, as if trying to shrink inside his boots. Behind him, two other ranch hands stood beside the flatbed truck, hats off, hands hanging at their sides, like they weren't sure whether to salute or apologize. The girl remained bowed, her shadow pooled beneath her like spilled ink. It took the interpreter, a Japanese-American corporal with quiet eyes, to step forward and gently touch her shoulder. She straightened slowly, not out of comfort, but command. Her gaze remained low. Her hands, trembling and thin as broomsticks, stayed clasped in front of her. When she finally raised her eyes, they didn't rise far, only to the cowboy's chest, where the buttons of his shirt shimmered with sweat. He'd expected rage, maybe defiance, maybe fear. But this was obedience. The other girls, maybe a dozen of them, stood frozen near the truck, unsure whether to follow her lead or hide behind the rusted tailgate. Their uniforms were threadbare, hanging like washed-out rags from skeletal frames. One girl wore mismatched shoes. Another had wrapped a towel around her waist like a skirt. The youngest couldn't have been more than 13. None of them looked like warriors. None of them looked like they belonged in the war at all. The cowboy rubbed the back of his neck and turned to the interpreter. "What did she say again?" "She said, 'I'll be your servant.'" He paused. "Like a maid?" "No," the corporal said gently. "More like property." Silence fell again, heavier this time. A horse snorted in the distance. The sun pressed down on their backs. The cowboy opened his mouth to say something, anything, but all that came out was a half-whispered, "Jesus." The camp wasn't really a camp. It had been a cattle ranch, the fences now doubled with barbed wire, the barns converted to dormitories, the horse stables cleared out to make room for bunks. The guards weren't soldiers by training, but ranchers wearing faded olive uniforms with dust still clinging to their jeans underneath. They'd been told to expect prisoners. Instead, they got girls who looked like they hadn't eaten in weeks and flinched at the sight of soap. He motioned toward one of the barns. "Take 'em inside. Show 'em the bunks." His voice cracked halfway through. He watched the girl, the one who bowed, shuffle forward in silence, her steps unsure, like someone walking barefoot across memory. He didn't know her name, not yet, but he would remember that bow for the rest of his life. She passed the fence post and stepped into the shadow of the barn. The interpreter followed, saying something soft in Japanese that the cowboy didn't understand, but he caught the tone. Not command, not warning, just permission. Inside the barn, the light shifted, cooler now, filtered through slats in the wood. Dust danced in the beams. A row of cots had been set up, each one draped with a wool blanket, folded corners like military beds. The girl paused at the doorway. She looked at the blanket the way a starving person might look at a roast, tempted, terrified. The cowboy watched from the door. She hadn't asked for food. She hadn't begged. She hadn't even asked for water. She had just bowed. That was all, and somehow that was worse. Later, around the fire pit out back, the other cowboys said little. One chewed his lip bloody, thinking about the way her knees had sunk into the dust. Another admitted he almost asked if she was lost, like a child wandered in from a roadside. None of them said what they were all thinking, that they'd expected demons and found ghosts, that these weren't soldiers. They were shadows of girls who had been taught the world. Outside, Japan was a fire pit, and now, standing here in the middle of a Texas ranch, they had no script for what came next. That night, the girl sat on her cot, back straight, blanket untouched beside her. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only watched the flicker of the oil lantern on the wall, the shadows it cast, moving like ghosts she still owed something to. The cowboy lingered outside the barn for a long time, the stars cold above him, and wondered how to offer kindness to someone who didn't believe she deserved it. Before she ever saw a cowboy or a cottonwood tree, she had been taught that kindness was a lie. Her name was Akiko, though she hadn't heard it spoken gently in months. In the scorched edges of a crumbling Japan, her world had been reduced to hunger, silence, and obedience. When the recruiters came to her village, they didn't ask, they commanded. At 15, she was drafted not as a soldier, but as something worse, a ghost in a nurse's uniform, expected to endure, not to live. She was handed a white armband and a ration cube, then marched into a makeshift barracks beside a field hospital that stank of sweat and iodine. There, they trained her to clean wounds, to measure morphine, and to remove bandages without making a sound. "You are the spine of the wounded," one instructor had said, pacing between rows of girls with shaved heads and stiff postures. "But you are not meant to survive." That part was unspoken, but everyone knew it. They didn't call them medics. They called them Taishantai, Volunteer Corps. But Akiko had never volunteered. She had simply been chosen, like a stone from a pile. What followed was weeks of drills, of kneeling through lectures on proper posture and emotional stillness. They were taught that American soldiers were beasts, that surrender was a fate worse than death, and that women taken alive would be disgraced beyond repair. In the pamphlets, sketched in grainy ink, were diagrams of how to hide a cyanide pill in your mouth, or how to jab a hairpin into your neck artery if captured. Akiko memorized them like prayers. They were also taught how to bandage a stump, how to identify gangrene, how to whisper last rites to a boy whose lungs had already collapsed. By the end of her first month, she could carry a stretcher with her eyes closed. Her hands never shook, but her stomach never stopped growling. The rations came thinner and thinner, sour rice, strips of bark boiled like noodles, salt stolen from dried seaweed. One morning, an officer came into the dormitory and read a letter aloud. Her brother had died in Manchuria. No details, no body, just an announcement and a command to return to work. Akiko did not cry. There was no time for crying, only folding sheets, sterilizing knives, and learning how to die. The hospital burned in August. The sky had turned orange in the night. No sirens, just fire. A wave of silence followed, broken only by the crackling of rooftops collapsing. And then a message filtered down like smoke. The Emperor had surrendered. The next day, the officers disappeared. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't give orders. They just vanished like ghosts in uniforms. Akiko stood in the doorway of the ruined infirmary, her hands still stained with someone else's blood, and waited for something, anything, to happen. What came instead was a truck, and then another. American soldiers stepped down, not monsters, not wolves, just men in boots with clipboards. One asked if she spoke English. She didn't answer. He didn't push. They were herded like cattle onto the back of a flatbed. Girls she had scrubbed floors beside, girls with hollow cheeks and haunted eyes. They clutched blankets, tin cups. Some held nothing at all. The trucks rolled toward the coast. Akiko counted the cracks in the wooden slats. At the harbor, the ship loomed like a floating city. She expected chains. She expected cages. What she saw instead were bunks. Real bunks. The kind made with mattresses and sheets. Food was handed to her. Rice, eggs, something sweet and alien. She didn't eat it. She stared at it like it was bait. Across the water, America waited, land of the enemy, land of lies, but also, perhaps, land of something else. She couldn't name it, not yet, only feel the soft pull of the waves beneath her feet. Akiko never spoke as the ship pulled away from the dock, but in her chest was a quiet truth growing louder with every mile. The war may have ended, but the instructions she had been given on how to die, they would take longer to forget. The bunkhouse smelled of sawdust and smoke. Akiko stood just inside the doorway, her eyes trying to adjust to the amber glow of lantern light. Rows of cots lined the walls, wooden, simple, each with a folded blanket and a pillow that looked like it belonged in someone's home, not in a prison. She didn't move at first. Something in her gut told her this was a test, that the comfort was false. She waited for the barked orders, for the slap on the back of her head, for the shame that always followed rest. But none came. A cowboy, his uniform wrinkled, boots caked in dust, stepped past her, nodding once as he pointed to the cot nearest the stove. It was empty, waiting. She walked toward it slowly, barefoot, each step soft against the plank floor. The warmth from the stove kissed her ankles, and for a moment she forgot she was a prisoner. Then she sat. The cot creaked beneath her weight, but held. The blanket was coarse, but clean. She ran her fingers along its edge, stopping when she felt the stitched seam, real thread, real fabric, not military rags. She gripped it tight and kept her head low. Outside, a coyote howled. Inside, no one spoke. The other women, a dozen or so scattered across the bunks, were already curled under their covers, silent shadows with wide eyes. One girl whispered a prayer, another clutched a comb like it was a weapon. Akiko did neither. She sat upright, hands in her lap, waiting for someone to take the blanket away. She didn't sleep. Her body had forgotten how. Her ears stayed alert for footsteps, for yelling, for that cold, familiar boot of punishment. But the only sound was the crackle of the stove and the occasional shifting of hay in the nearby barn. In the morning, the door opened with a groan, and a new kind of confusion stepped in with the daylight. A tray, white enamel, a cup of something dark, steaming, and beside it, a biscuit. Not rice, not porridge. A biscuit, round, thick, golden brown, still warm. The guard who placed it on the table near her didn't speak. He didn't make a face. He didn't smile, but he didn't sneer either. He just set it down, nodded once, and walked away like he was dropping off mail. Akiko stared at the tray like it might detonate. She looked around. The others had food too, some already chewing, some staring just like her. Her stomach twisted, a deep, aching pull that made her vision blur. The smell was unbearable. Butter, flour, something almost sweet. Her mouth filled with saliva. She reached out, then pulled back. What if it was poisoned? What if this was the humiliation she had been promised? But nothing happened, so she picked up the biscuit, slowly, carefully. It was heavier than she expected, fluffy, dense. She raised it to her mouth and took the tiniest bite, and immediately her jaw froze. It wasn't bad, it wasn't foreign, it was good. The warmth spread down her throat like a fire she hadn't known she needed. Her hands trembled. She chewed, then swallowed, then bit again, this time faster. Her dignity and her hunger waged war in her chest. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Why would someone feed an enemy? Why offer softness where there had only been sharp edges? It was easier to survive cruelty. She understood cruelty. This biscuit, this bed, this silence was worse, because it made her question everything, because it was not violence that broke her, but mercy. That was the part she had no defense for. By the time she finished, her fingers were greasy, and her heart was a tangle of guilt and warmth. She wiped her hands on her uniform and looked around the room. No one had punished her for eating. No one had even watched. And that, somehow, was the most disarming part of all. She wasn't used to being unseen. Not in this way. Back home she was invisible by necessity, an auxiliary shadow meant to serve, suffer, and stay silent. But here, in this strange Texas compound of wood, dust, and biscuits, her invisibility carried no threat. No man barked orders. No woman towered over her with a switch. She wasn't being watched. She was simply left alone. That scared her more than surveillance ever had. On the second morning, the cowboy returned. The same one who'd first seen her bow in the dirt. He stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse, hat in hand, unsure how to enter. His boots thudded softly across the wood, the sound of someone trying not to sound like anything. Beside him, the interpreter lingered with a clipboard. "She sleep okay?" the cowboy asked. "She didn't sleep at all," the interpreter answered, not looking up. The cowboy nodded slowly, then knelt beside her cot, where Akiko sat, legs folded beneath her, blanket wrapped around her, shoulders like armor. He said something, soft, deliberate. The interpreter translated. He says, "You don't have to work for anything. You're not a servant. You're a guest here." Akiko stared. That word again. Guest. She didn't know it in English, but she recognized its weight in Japanese. She shook her head, then looked down at her hands. The cowboy rubbed the back of his neck. He said something else. The interpreter hesitated, then sighed and translated. He says, "You fed soldiers in a hospital. Maybe now you can feed chickens, if you want." The absurdity struck her like a slap. Chickens? That was the task? Not scrubbing floors or peeling potatoes or boiling linens stained with blood. Chickens. But she followed him anyway, past the barracks, past the corral where a lone horse grazed in lazy circles, and toward a pen where hens clucked beneath a patchwork tin roof. He didn't make her touch anything at first, just pointed, showed her the feed, scooped some with a rusted tin pail, tossed it gently. The hens came running, pecking and flapping, their feathers a flurry of dust and purpose. Akiko blinked. It was not war, it was normal. Then he handed her the pail. No words, just the gesture. She froze, her hands tightened around the handle. She looked at him, then at the birds. They weren't afraid of her. They didn't care who she had once served, what she had been taught, or how many rations she had once scraped from the bottom of a pot. They were hungry, simple, alive. She scattered the feed. The birds rushed forward. She stepped back, startled, then caught herself and laughed. Not aloud, but just behind her ribs. The sound surprised her. The cowboy grinned and tilted his head. "You did good," he said. The interpreter didn't bother translating. She had understood. That afternoon, the cowboy returned to the bunkhouse with a jar of cold water and a folded cloth. He didn't speak much, just set it on her crate like an offering. When she bowed out of habit, he stopped her with a gesture. "No need for that," he said. "She says she must show respect," the interpreter added. He knelt, looked her in the eyes, and said slowly, "Respect is earned, but you don't owe us anything. Not now, not ever." She didn't understand the words. Not then. But the tone lodged itself in her chest like a pebble tossed into still water. That night, Akiko lay beneath the wool blanket, the scent of feed still on her fingers, and thought of the hens, clumsy, squawking, soft, creatures with no stake in empire or shame, just hunger and sun and rhythm. She had not been punished. She had not been stripped of her worth. She had been trusted, not to die, but to feed something that lived. The next test came in a bowl. Midday, after the sun had climbed to its highest, and the chickens had settled into lazy circles of dirt baths and contented pecking, the cowboy returned, not with feed, but with food. He carried a chipped ceramic bowl in both hands like it held something sacred. The smell hit her first, rich, warm, savory. Stew. Akiko sat on the shaded porch outside the bunkhouse, her knees folded beneath her, her arms around them. The air was thick with the scent. Beef, carrots, maybe even onions. Her mouth watered before she could stop it. Her stomach twisted. The bowl was placed beside her with a spoon tucked carefully along the rim. She didn't move. The cowboy waited a moment, then nodded once and stepped back, returning to his post near the gate. No orders, no threats, just quiet presence. Akiko stared at the bowl. The surface shimmered with tiny golden droplets of fat. The scent reminded her of something she couldn't name, something lost. She picked up the spoon, hands trembling, and took a small sip. Salt, warmth, meat that fell apart without chewing. It was delicious. Too delicious. She paused, then took another bite, and another. Halfway through, her throat tightened, her shoulders hunched forward. She put the spoon down and covered her mouth. But it was too late. The tears came. Not loud, not sobbing, just hot, silent rivers sliding down her cheeks and pooling at her jaw. She wasn't crying from joy. It wasn't gratitude. It was guilt, crushing, soul-deep guilt. Because while she sat here, cradled in warmth and silence, her mother was likely cold. Her little cousin, who used to chase dragonflies barefoot, was probably scavenging for bark. Her brother, if he was alive, might be rotting in a camp without name or food. And here she was, eating beef stew made by cowboys. It felt like betrayal, each bite like swallowing her family's pain. She stopped eating, let the bowl sit beside her, the stew growing cold while the sun dropped slowly across the Texas sky. That night she didn't sleep, not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't. And that was the most confusing part. She lay on her cot, the blanket up to her chin, her eyes fixed on the wooden beams above her. The other girls slept, their breaths slow and shallow. In her mind, she saw her village, not as it was during the bombings, but before. The corner rice shop, the old man who sang to his dog, her mother kneeling by the stove, coaxing flame from damp twigs. The memory sliced deeper than punishment ever could. She had survived, somehow. Not by valor, not by choice, but by accident. And now survival felt like failure. The next morning she returned the bowl, scrubbed clean. She placed it on the crate outside the mess tent and bowed, not deeply. just enough. The cowboy saw her from a distance, said nothing, but later, when she went to feed the chickens, there was a new bowl waiting. Stew again, hot. She ate it, quietly, slowly, because hunger didn't wait for permission. And maybe, just maybe, neither did healing. But that didn't mean the shame had vanished. It clung to her ribs like a second skin. Because abundance, when given by an enemy, wasn't a gift. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, Akiko saw herself, not as a martyr or a ghost, but as a girl who had lived while others hadn't, and she didn't yet know how to carry that weight. The next morning, she was led not to the yard or the kitchen, but to a low wooden building at the edge of the compound. Steam curled from its open door, carrying with it a scent so unfamiliar she hesitated at the threshold. Warmth, clean warmth, the kind that seeped into skin instead of burning it. The interpreter gestured gently, and she stepped inside. The room was lined with wooden benches and metal basins. Steam clung to the ceiling like fog caught indoors. On a small stool sat a folded bundle, cloth, pale and neatly stacked. Soap rested on top, white and smooth, its scent sharp and almost sweet. She stared at it, uncertain. In her world, cleanliness had always been a luxury reserved for the moments before something terrible happened. The mind learned to associate soap with endings. The door closed softly behind her. No guards, no shouting, just the quiet drip of water from a pipe and the low hum of heat. She stood still, her hands clenched at her sides, until the interpreter spoke from behind her. "You can wash," she said gently. "No one will come in." Akiko hesitated. Then she undid the ties of her uniform. The fabric slid from her shoulders like it had been waiting to fall. She folded it carefully and set it on the bench, the way she had been taught long ago, back when order still meant something. When she reached for the soap, her fingers trembled. The smell was clean, almost sweet. She held it to her nose, breathing in, and for the first time since the war began, she felt something loosen in her chest. The water was warm, not scalding, not rationed. It poured over her shoulders, down her back, along arms that had forgotten what comfort felt like. She closed her eyes. Dirt and sweat slid away. So did something heavier. She scrubbed slowly, deliberately, as if afraid the water might stop if she hurried. When she washed her hair, it took longer. The knots resisted, clung to memory. She worked patiently, jaw tight, breathing steady, until at last the tangles loosened and the water ran clear. She did not cry. She simply stood there, letting the water fall, feeling her own body again, feeling that it still belonged to her. When she stepped out, a towel waited, thick, clean, folded with care. She wrapped it around herself and sat on the bench, the heat sinking into her bones. A bundle lay beside her. Fresh clothes, simple and plain, but clean, and on top of them, folded with deliberate care, a blanket. She touched it as if it might vanish. The wool was coarse but warm, heavy enough to matter. She pressed it to her chest and felt something tighten in her throat. Not tears, those had been spent. This was quieter, deeper. When she emerged, wrapped in the blanket, the air felt different against her skin. The world looked softer, the colors less harsh. The cowboy stood at a distance, pretending not to watch. When he saw her, he tipped his hat slightly. Not as a soldier, not as a guard. As a man acknowledging another person. She didn't bow this time. That night, she lay on her cot, the blanket drawn up to her chin. It smelled faintly of soap and sun. She traced its edge with her fingers, memorizing its texture. This, she realized, was not a tool. It was not a ration. It was hers. And in that realization, something shifted. She thought of herself not as a burden or a captured thing, but as someone permitted to take up space. The blanket did not judge her. It did not ask where she had been or what she had done. It simply warmed her. In the quiet, she felt the weight she carried begin to change shape. It was still heavy, still painful, but no longer crushing. For the first time since the war began, she did not feel like a shadow. She felt like someone who existed. The realization followed her into the evening, clinging to her like the scent of soap that still lingered on her skin. It followed her as she stepped outside the bunkhouse and into the wide open yard, where lanterns had been strung between fence posts, and the low murmur of voices drifted through the warm air. Someone was playing a harmonica, slow, uneven notes that bent and curled into the night. Others laughed, real laughter, not forced, not hysterical. The sound unsettled her more than the gunfire ever had. She stood at the edge of the light, arms folded tightly around herself, watching. The cowboys sat at a rough wooden table, boots crossed, sleeves rolled up, cards slapped against wood. A bottle clinked. A burst of laughter rose and fell again. Among them she saw other women from the camp, some sitting stiffly, others leaning forward, curious despite themselves. One of them laughed, not a nervous breath or a polite sound, but a full laugh, round and unguarded. The sound cut through Akiko like a blade. Her chest tightened. Her first instinct was shame. How could anyone laugh here? How could anyone forget? The war had taken everything, homes, fathers, names. Laughter felt like betrayal, like treason against the dead. She stood frozen, fists clenched at her sides, as if waiting for punishment to fall from the sky. Then the woman laughed again. And again. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't cruel. It was startled, surprised laughter, the kind that bursts out when something catches you off guard. A man across the table had tried to shuffle cards with one hand and dropped the entire deck onto the dirt. The sound of paper scattering made everyone jump, then laugh harder. Even the guards were smiling. Akiko's heart pounded. She told herself to turn away, to go back inside, to sit on her cot and count breaths until the night passed. But her feet didn't move. A chair scraped the dirt near her. She turned to find the same cowboy who had shown her the chickens, standing there, holding a deck of cards. He gestured to an empty spot at the table. Not insistently, not expectantly, just an open invitation. She shook her head. He smiled, not wide, not mocking, just enough to say it was all right. He set the cards down and stepped back, giving her space. The others went on playing, laughing when the wrong card was drawn, groaning at bad luck. The moment passed, but something in her had shifted. Later, when the laughter faded and the night grew still, she found herself drifting closer to the table. She did not sit. She stood behind one of the women and watched the game. The rules were foreign, but the rhythm was not. Cards passed from hand to hand. Someone won. Someone groaned. Someone laughed again. She realized then that laughter wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a trap. It was something people did when they forgot to be afraid, even for a moment. "Do you want to try?" the cowboy asked quietly. She hesitated. Every lesson she'd ever learned screamed that this was wrong. That joy was indulgence. That warmth was weakness. That smiling in the presence of the enemy was betrayal. But her hand moved anyway. She took the cards. Her fingers shook, but she held them. The paper was worn smooth from use. She did not understand the rules, but she mimicked the motions, copying the way the others played. When she placed a card down, the table erupted in laughter, not mocking but delighted. Someone clapped. Heat rushed to her face. For a moment she felt dizzy, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to happiness. And then, just as quickly, shame followed. Her chest tightened, her eyes burned. She dropped the cards as if they were on fire and stood abruptly, bowing once, deeply. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She didn't know to whom. The cowboy stood, concern flickering across his face. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said softly. But she had already turned away, heart racing, the echo of laughter ringing in her ears. Later, alone on her cot, she curled onto her side and pulled the blanket up to her chin. The laughter replayed in her mind, not cruel, not mocking, but free. She pressed her face into the fabric, breathing in the clean scent of soap and wool, and felt tears slip silently down her temples, because for the first time since the war began, she had laughed, and in doing so she had betrayed something old and sacred inside herself. She did not yet know whether that betrayal was a sin or the beginning of freedom. It came folded, paper, thick and pale, with edges too clean to belong to war. Alongside it, a pencil no longer than her finger, dulled and well-used, but still capable of marking the world. The interpreter handed them to her quietly after breakfast, with a brief nod. "They say, you can write home?" Akiko stared at the paper for a long time. A blank page, an invitation, a trap. Her fingers curled around the pencil, then released. She didn't touch the paper for hours. She returned to the bunkhouse and sat on the edge of her cot, the page laid flat on the wooden crate beside her. Sunlight filtered through the slats, tracing shadows across the floor. She had been offered a voice, something denied to her since the moment of surrender. Not to explain herself, not to confess, just to say she was alive. But even that felt dangerous. What could she say? The truth felt too large, too strange, the lies too brittle. She remembered what they had told her before leaving Japan. If you are captured, your soul belongs to no one. Do not speak, do not write. Silence is honor. But she was tired of silence, so, with a breath, she picked up the pencil. Her first line came slow, each stroke deliberate. "I am alive." Then, beneath it, "I eat well, I am treated kindly." She paused. The pencil trembled in her grip. Her thoughts surged faster than she could write. "There is music here. The guards are not cruel. I washed my hair yesterday. I have a blanket that is mine." I smiled. I laughed. "I don't understand this war anymore." She didn't write that last part immediately. That final sentence hovered, unspoken, hovering at the edge of her mind like a cliff. But her hand moved again, and she wrote it, slowly. "I do not understand this war anymore." She set the pencil down. Her breath felt shallow, not from fear, but from something else. Exposure. Honesty peeled you open. She folded the letter carefully and handed it back. The interpreter didn't read it, at least not in front of her. The paper disappeared into a satchel. Later, she overheard the guards mention that all letters would be routed through Tokyo. She never knew if it reached her family. But she would later learn from another girl, months after release, that letters like hers, especially those that hinted at kindness from the enemy, were intercepted, censored, destroyed. Still, something changed the moment she set that pencil down, because writing the truth, however quietly, had consequences. That evening, as she sat with the others near the corral, the harmonica sounded different. Not sadder, not happier, just clearer. She watched the others speak, eat, smile. Her own hands felt steadier. She was still confused, still ashamed, but no longer mute. That letter had not just been a message to her mother. It had been a confession, not of guilt, but of contradiction. And in that contradiction, she had begun to reclaim her name. Not just as a daughter of Japan, not just as a prisoner, but as a person. If this story is moving you, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The ribbon came without ceremony. No announcement, no explanation. It appeared one afternoon folded neatly beside her tin cup, pale blue against the rough wood of the table. Akiko noticed it only after she had finished washing her hands, the water still dripping from her fingers. For a long moment she simply stared at it, unsure whether it was meant for her or merely left behind by accident. It was soft, cotton maybe, worn thin at the edges but clean. She touched it with the tips of her fingers, half expecting someone to scold her for taking what wasn't hers. No one did. The rancher's daughter stood a few steps away, pretending to busy herself with a stack of folded towels. She was younger than Akiko, with sun-browned arms and hair pulled back in a careless knot. When she noticed Akiko looking, she smiled and gave a small nod. Not a command, not an offering, just a suggestion. Akiko hesitated, then lifted the ribbon and tied it into her hair the way she used to as a girl. Before the sirens, before the drills, before the world had narrowed to survival. The fabric brushed her cheek as she tied the knot. It felt almost unreal, like touching a memory rather than an object. When she looked up, the girl smiled wider. Not approving, not approvingly, just warm. Something in Akiko's chest loosened. That afternoon she caught her reflection in a cracked mirror by the wash basin. It startled her. The face looking back was thinner, paler, marked by months of strain. But there was something else there now. Not fear, not obedience, something softer, something alive. She lifted a hand and touched the ribbon. It didn't make her beautiful. It made her present. Later, when she carried water back to the kitchen, one of the cowboys held out a tin cup of coffee. He didn't say anything. He didn't insist. He just held it there, waiting. For the first time, she didn't flinch. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his as she did. The contact lasted less than a second, but it felt like crossing a threshold. She took a sip. Bitter, hot, real. As she drank, she realized something else had changed. The constant knot in her chest, the one that tightened every time someone looked her way, had loosened, not vanished, but softened. The world had stopped feeling like a trap. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the camp filled with the hum of insects and distant laughter, she sat on the steps of the bunkhouse with the ribbon tied in her hair. The light caught in it, turning it almost silver. One of the other women passed by and smiled at her, not with envy or pity, but recognition. For the first time, Akiko felt seen, not as a prisoner, not as a symbol, but as a person among others. She was still cautious, still careful, but something fundamental had shifted. She no longer moved as though expecting to be struck. She walked with her head slightly higher, her steps more certain. That night, as she lay beneath her blanket, she ran her fingers over the ribbon again. It wasn't precious because it was beautiful. It was precious because it was given freely. No orders, no expectations, no price. She thought of the word she had once feared, freedom. Not the loud kind shouted in speeches, but the quiet kind that settled into the bones. The kind that arrived not with flags, but with small kindnesses. Outside, the wind moved through the fields, carrying the smell of hay and earth. Inside, a young woman who had once believed herself nothing more than a tool allowed herself to breathe. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was becoming someone again. The morning she left, the sky was the color of ash, pale and low, without warmth but without malice. A truck idled near the gates, its engine muttering softly in the background. The POWs were told to gather their things. There was no roll call, no shouting, just quiet footsteps and the rustle of canvas bags. Akiko stood beside the bunkhouse with her blanket folded in her arms. In her breast pocket was the letter she had written, the one she didn't know if her mother would ever read. Tucked into the collar of her shirt was the blue ribbon tied tightly in her hair. She had combed it that morning, carefully, slowly. She had even smiled at her reflection. The cowboy who had first looked at her with a mix of confusion and pity now stood near the steps, arms crossed, hat pulled low. When she approached him, she did not bow immediately. She looked him in the eye. He nodded. Then she bowed, not deeply, not in submission, but in thanks, in respect. Her shoulders were straight, her gaze steady. When she rose again, he tipped his hat, one edge of his mouth tugging upward. She didn't cry. She stepped onto the transport slowly, carrying more than her bundle. Inside her, something had rearranged. Around her, the other women moved with quiet resolve. Some held hands, others walked alone. But each of them looked different than they had months ago. Not just thinner or cleaner, but changed. On the road out, she watched the ranch vanish behind a cloud of dust. The fences, the bunkhouse, the corral. It all blurred, then disappeared. But the weight it had placed inside her remained. At first, she had arrived believing she was nothing but a captured object, her purpose stripped, her country lost. But now, she understood something her instructors had never taught her. That dignity wasn't something others gave you. It was something you held on to or rebuilt, even from ashes. She still bowed. But now, she chose when and why. Her body was no longer merely surviving. It was remembering how to live. She ran a thumb along the fraying edge of the ribbon in her hair. In the bunkhouse, she had sewn the ends to keep it from unraveling. She would keep it when she returned home. She didn't know what kind of home would be waiting, if anything. She didn't know if her mother had survived, if her brother had perished, or if Tokyo still stood. But she knew this. She would not return as a ghost. She would arrive with stories no one in her village would believe. That Americans had fed her stew, that cowboys had shown her how to hold a chicken without fear, that she had learned to laugh while holding cards, that she had worn a ribbon and written a letter and tasted kindness from those who were once her enemy. What she could never explain, but would always carry, was how confusing that kindness had been, how it had burned more deeply than cruelty ever could, how it had changed her. At the edge of the horizon, the ranch became a memory, but in her chest it remained a rupture, a scar that glowed not with pain, but with impossible clarity. The war was not undone. The dead were not revived. But she had not been erased, and when the ship one day carried her back across the sea, she would arrive not as a servant, not as a symbol, but as a girl who had walked through surrender and emerged with something like grace. If this story touched you, please like the video and drop a comment below sharing where in the world you're watching from. Thank you for helping preserve stories that history almost forgot.